The city had a rhythm that never learned to sleep. Sirens stitched the night together with neon seams, and the rich moved through glass towers while the rest of the world crowded the underpass, the alleys, the cardboard sanctuaries. On an unusually chilly morning, when the thermometer read a stubborn 36 and steam rose from subway grates like ghosts, a man with a limp and a coat 2 sizes too small found his way to the plaza in front of the highest glass cathedral of money in the city. He called no name, had no address, and answered questions with a shrug that could have been fatigue or habit. People saw him as an interruption, a blur of dirty cuffs and hollow cheeks. He slept where benches allowed, and when they did not, he slept standing, head bowed against a lamppost, clutching a small canvas bag of all his belongings. His life was a collage of missed trains and discarded sandwiches. He survived by folding himself small in the corners of a city that preferred tidy narratives. On the 3rd floor of that glass tower, behind a roster of silent nurses and polished teak, a billionaire lay in a room that smelled of antiseptic and rare lilies. He was a man who had once curated empires out of spreadsheets and appetite. He lived in headlines, philanthropist, tycoon, a name that fit on the marquee of a new museum. Then a stroke or a fall or a secret aneurysm had taken the part of him that answered calls and signed checks. They called it a coma, a long, unlit hallway where he went to wait. The hospital wing hummed with machines that translated body into numbers. Beeps became punctuation, respirators sighed in the cadence of accounting. The billionaire's chest rose and fell by the mechanics of medicine. His hands, which had once closed deals by the dozen, rested inert on quilts that cost more than the house the homeless man had once rented. Family portraits lined the walls, smiling like accusations. The son visited sometimes and left with a suit a degree tighter and a schedule more elaborate than his presence warranted. The homeless man watched from the plaza. He did not belong in the lobby with its marble and orchids. He found an alcove that let him see the tinted windows of the hospital wing. He came each day at dawn when the city's light was gray with possibility, and warmed his hands on the cardboard he used as a shield. There was a curious steadiness to him. Children who darted past him would glance over their shoulders because he wore a look of someone who had once been part of a larger story and had simply missed a page. On a Thursday that smelled faintly of rain, a guard opened the main doors and juggled a stack of files. A delivery van trundled to the curb. The homeless man, driven by a mix of insomnia and a habit of following the human pulse, drifted closer than usual. His cane tapped a rhythm on the terrazzo floor, an irregular metronome. Inside, a new nurse rearranged a vase, a volunteer clipped a ribbon, and the billionaire lay small and luminous under the monitoring lights. No one noticed the man step into the lobby. He moved like a thought, as if the building had inhaled and made room. Security, more interested in credentials than in the lives of strangers, did not stop him. He wandered toward the elevator bank as if drawn by a compass only he could feel. The doors closed and the lift rose. The billionaire's floor opened like a secret. The room smelled of lemon and cleaned linen. The homeless man hesitated, then approached the bed. For a moment he simply stood and watched the billionaire's face, as if searching for something familiar. He had watched 1,000 faces in the city, and he could read the economy of a mouth, the small panic of a brow. He reached out with fingers crooked by years in a different climate, an existence without steady warmth. His hand hovered and then, with the delicate terror of a trespasser, he placed it lightly on the billionaire's forearm. The monitors kept their steady testimonies. The homeless man closed his eyes and spoke without thinking in a voice that belonged to the alleys and to sanctuaries made under bridges. He told a story, about a small dog that had once followed him for 3 months, about a sunrise he had learned to love after a life of bad nights, about a woman who had given him a peach once and how the memory of that sweetness had kept him alive in winter. His words were not meant for the billionaire as a receiver, they were the sort of human sound that insists the world has not forgotten how to say soft things. Then something happened that nobody could have planned. The billionaire's left hand twitched beneath the blanket. It was a small motion, a single resentful leaf against the wind, but it was a motion that carried the weight of a miracle to those who loved improbable things. The homeless man stiffened, the cane between his legs forgotten. He lowered his voice and continued, coaxing the man inside to return by slow, careful sentences. He described the city's light, the cheap coffee by the corner that burned with honesty, the clumsy kindness of shopkeepers who left extra bread in a drawer. The twitch became a tremor. The billionaire's eyelids fluttered like moth wings. The monitors, which had been translating the body into comforting increments, made a different sound, fluctuation that hinted at life. Nurses rushed in at the alarm, efficient as choreography. Hands that had known nothing of the homeless man's story flipped switches and called orders. The son burst through a door and saw a man he hardly recognized on the bed, lips parted, breathing on his own for the first time in months. Those first moments after waking are slippery. The billionaire's eyes focused with the pain of reclaimed horizons. He took small, ragged breaths as though relearning the grammar of air. He blinked at the lights, at the bouquet, and finally at the homeless man standing awkwardly by the bed. The billionaire's gaze sharpened with a peculiar mix of confusion and accusation. Who was this unaccounted-for witness to his rebirth? No one knew whether awakening would mean a return to the man he once was. Will returned in fractions. A memory of a promise here, the echo of a name there. His speech came in a sieve trapped behind gravel. He whispered a single syllable that sounded like thanks or a confusion or perhaps both. The homeless man answered with a smile that had no teeth of pretense. He shrugged as if to explain away the miracle. The hospital buzzed with a new kind of electricity. Reporters would later lean on the glass and picture a narrative that fit headlines. Social feeds would splice the moment into 10-second bites. The son took the billionaire's hand like a pen reclaiming a contract. The nurses documented vitals. Among the chorus of calculated moves and protocols, the homeless man became an odd punctuation mark in their tidy sentence. After the storm of messages and tests, some moments mellowed into quieter decisions. The billionaire's room became a small theater for gentle recuperation. The son stayed in shifts, sometimes leaving for meetings and sometimes staying until his suit adapted to the thin hospital air. The homeless man, who had no place on any roster, began to appear at the same time each morning. He sat at a distance, like an animal at the edge of light, watching the slow cartography of recovery. People asked questions they had no courage to voice. Who was he? Why did he come? He gave answers that were fragments. I used to live across the river. I lost a job, lost an apartment. I remember a laugh from a room like this. He invented little truths to keep the world from needing too much. He did not ask for money. He did not want credit. He only wanted to tell the man about the dog, about the peach, about mornings that felt like new pages. As the billionaire's speech improved, small, then larger, memories returned. A safe combination. A childhood nickname. A smell that belonged to a certain house in upstate summers. He began to talk about the office with an ache that hinted at both longing and obligation. The son listened with an expression that was sometimes tender, sometimes barbed. The world outside the ward yawned and resumed its business. One evening, when sunlight from the west painted the room in orange, the billionaire turned on his side and with effort reached out. He took the homeless man's hand in both of his own. It was a simple clasp that said less about ownership and more about acknowledgement. The billionaire squeezed, and in that pressure was the recognition that life was a collage of last chances and strange intersections. That night, as word of the waking rippled through the building, the billionaire asked for something that surprised everyone who knew him. He wanted to meet the man who had been with him at dawn, the man with the limp in the bag. He wanted to know his name. The security team, practiced in the theater of logistics, arranged a meeting in a small conference room. There the two men sat opposite each other at a table designed for committees, and the billionaire leaned forward with curiosity like a child with a newly found secret. The homeless man cleared his throat. He gave a name that might have been a real one or a borrowed one, and the billionaire nodded as if that, too, could be a kind of restitution. The billionaire asked questions, not about money or accounts but about the dog and the peach in the corner coffee the man liked. He asked in the halting grammar of wishful recovery. Their conversation was peculiar and moving. It was a negotiation between two lives that had found each other by accident and possibly by design. Days later, a decision moved through the billionaire like a tidal suggestion. He wanted to do something that would stitch the edges between his old life and the seam of this new chance. He called legal minds and advisors and found the language that would allow him to build a small program. Housing vouchers, a job placement initiative, a fund for people whose lives had been a series of unfortunate misalignments. He wanted a legacy that did not reside solely in plaques but in the quiet renovation of lives. The homeless man's reaction was complex. He had lived on a diet of solitude and small prizes. A sudden offer of housing felt like a gust of wind that might lift him or throw him to the ground. He accepted with a guarded hope and an old man's caution. He took a small apartment across town, painted the walls a color that made him think of warm mornings, and kept a photograph of the billionaire in a frame that did not belong to any gallery. Months folded into one another. The program grew modestly, then steadily, funded by an endowment that had the billionaire's name and a humility that surprised the board. People who had lived like the homeless man found a roof and a counselor, a place to receive mail and a name that was not a question. The city noticed, and for a time the billionaire was no longer only a figure in headlines but a quiet actor in a series of human restorations. Yet life is reluctant to promise linear tidy arcs. The homeless man, now with keys and a modest sofa, sometimes walked to the plaza at dawn and sat on the same bench. It was not because he missed the cold. It was because he liked to remember the exact moment a hand had twitched and the city had learned to breathe differently. The billionaire visited sometimes, less as a spectacle and more as a man who had been given a second draft. One morning, several months in, a headline tried to condense the story into a single line. Reporters asked about a miracle, lawyers asked about responsibility, and critics asked whether compassion had become an investor's new portfolio. The homeless man read none of it. He made coffee, watered the plant on his sill, and walked to the small community room where he told stories to people who had found their way to the program. He told them about the dog, the peach, the sunrise, and about the day he stepped into a room and found a life shifting beneath his feet. The billionaire, older by mark and softer at the edges, listened in the back row. He had reclaimed things beyond his bank accounts: the capacity to be astonished, the willingness to be present for a stranger's mundane confessions. On the day the program turned a year, they held a small gathering. No speeches, only coffee and food and folding chairs. A poster listed commitments in modest language: housing, job training, sanitation assistance. A woman who had once lived in a station's cubby told her story with hands that shook in the memory of better nights. At the end of the evening, the billionaire took the stage and, with a voice that still bore the timbre of recovery, spoke about small mercies and the odd geometry of luck. He spoke about the hand that had landed on his arm in silence and about the man who had told him about a peach. He did not claim to be a savior. He extended a kind of invitation, that people look once more at the edges of their city, where life continued to be lived in fragments. The crowd applauded in a way that felt like the patching of a rent in a familiar coat. The homeless man stood at the side, hands in his pockets, blinking at a life that felt like it had been altered not by spectacle but by a series of small, insistent choices. He had found a home but not a title. He had been part of a story that newspapers would simplify and that would eventually settle into rumor. He returned to the plaza sometimes, not out of need but out of memory, as if to calibrate the truth of what had happened. People continued to weave their narratives. The billionaire's company shifted some practices, allocating resources to community liaison and to mental health services. The program evolved, welcomed critics, and adapted to the messy reality of human need. The homeless man, who once moved like an interruption, taught other residents to find the small pleasures in the mornings: a perfect cup of coffee, a joke that landed, the way sunlight hit an old photograph. In the quiet after the work, when the city settled into its elective mutter, the billionaire and the homeless man would sometimes walk along the river. They did not always speak. Sometimes they watched barges drift by and imagined lives that might unfold differently. Once, the billionaire asked a crooked question about fate, and the homeless man answered with an anecdote about the peach that made both of them laugh. The story that started with a twitch became something less tidy and more human. It was a story of fragile returns, of small hands offered without expectation, and of two men whose lives intersected on a hospital morning. It became a lesson that miracles are rarely the fireworks of legend. They are often the quiet insistence of one person choosing to stay, to tell, to press a hand to another's arm and say, "I remember you." The city, in its indifferent ways, kept moving, but a corner of it had learned to breathe a little differently because two men decided to keep the conversation alive.